For most leagues, the fantasy playoffs start this week, and we're no longer interested in who can help us down the road or who can we stash to later use in our lineup. It's all about who can help us right now. So the big difference in our waiver wire show this week, I'm breaking down the guys in order that will be able to help you out right away to bring home that fantasy football championship. Yo, what is going on, Headliner Nation? If you're watching this show right now, chances are you're probably in the playoffs for your fantasy football league. So congratulations on making it this far, but the job is not done as of yet. And for the waiver wire show all year long, we are diving into the guys that we could stash, that we could stream, the guys that can not only help us out right away, but long term. But that doesn't matter anymore. Here in the playoffs, we're only interested in who can help us right now or maybe over the next week or two. So this week, in order for each position, I am gonna break down the top guys to add to your fantasy roster, and we're gonna be looking at who can help immediately or maybe who has the best playoff schedule. Hit that like button for me, subscribe if you're new here, turn on the bell notifications, and let's hop into it. We're gonna talk running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends. Then I've got quarterbacks and defensive special teams after that. Is there anybody that you should be dropping right now? We'll discuss it at the end. We had a couple of starters potentially get banged up in week 14, Alexander Mattison and Josh Jacobs. Both ended up leaving their game early with apparent injuries. And as of this recording, we haven't heard much about them. But Ty Chandler from Minnesota has been a guy that people have been picking up and dropping for a few weeks now. But if Mattison is going to miss any significant time or even this week, he is going to be the #1 waiver priority ad in all of fantasy football. And for Amir Abdullah, I'm going to go ahead and list him over Zamir White for the Las Vegas Raiders, because Abdullah's going to see some runs on the ground, but his biggest contribution will be through the air. I could see some dump offs going to him, and I could see him having much more fantasy value than what Zamir White does. Dante Foreman is going to get a really tough matchup going up against Cleveland this week, but the reason I've got him at #3 right now for running backs is because he had 13 touches against the Lions compared to a combined 4 from the other running backs on the roster, Khalil Herbert and Roschon Johnson. He's clearly the #1 in the matchups coming up. And while Cleveland might not be a great one to finish the season, we might get a little bit more value out of him. Jerick McKinnon is hovering right around 40% owned. And even though he was out-touched by CEH, his touchdown took him over in terms of fantasy value. And given the upcoming matchups, it is possible that we see way more Jerick McKinnon moving forward. We know New England can be a little bit stingy on the ground, and their defense wasn't great last week going up against Pittsburgh, but I do think that they get back on track this week. And going up against Kansas City, Jerick McKinnon could definitely see more touches than Clyde Edwards-Helaire, especially if CEH has trouble getting started on the ground. Rico Dowdle's name has been coming up for a while, not just because if you're a Tony Pollard owner, you should also have him on your roster, but because it seems down the stretch here, he may have some standalone value, because he's getting some pretty opportune touches in the red zone to be able to score touchdowns. Keep an eye on the workload for Tony Pollard the rest of the way, because if Rico Dowdle is playing well, we could end up seeing more snaps for him and potentially more touches. Now, Antonio Gibson is coming out of the bye, but Brian Robinson had some hamstring issues the week before the bye. I haven't heard a whole lot of updated information on Brian Robinson as of yet, so we're going to keep an eye on it. And over the next few days, if we find out that Brian Robinson could be limited, Antonio Gibson may actually bump up a few spots in these rankings here. Chase Brown isn't getting a ton of touches right now for Cincinnati, but the touches he is getting, it seems like he's doing quite a bit with. Would not be surprised to see him continue to see some of those high leverage touches down the stretch. Really, for me, it's more about handcuffing Joe Mixon right now. So we'll continue to monitor how much Chase Brown is being utilized. He's not very high on my priority list right now because he doesn't have the same standalone value as what I believe Rico Dowdle may end up having down the stretch. But if he does see some more time here in the next couple of weeks, it might be better to own him than be trying to grab him off waivers. Wide receivers are going to be extremely thin this week, and we're going to start with KJ Osborne from Minnesota. Justin Jefferson had to leave the game with a chest injury and apparently even had a hospital visit with it. And because of that, Osborne ended up having 7 targets this weekend, second most on the team behind TJ Hawkinson. We had talked about KJ Osborne as a potential fill-in when Justin Jefferson went down earlier in the season. But KJ Osborne ended up getting banged up right after that. Now he's healthy, back on the field, and could potentially be a very valuable target down the stretch. Odell Beckham Jr. caught 4 of his 10 targets for 97 yards and a touchdown this past weekend. And since Mark Andrews went out with his injury, it really feels like Odell Beckham Jr. is becoming the #1 target on this team. Lamar Jackson is leaning on the veteran to help push this Baltimore team into the playoffs, and for your fantasy playoff team, could end up being a really nice wide receiver 3 or even potential flex option. A lot of people are still eyeing Parker Washington because he has touchdowns in back-to-back games, but I'm going to go ahead and follow the volume in the playoffs and go with Zay Jones in this episode that has 22 targets over the last 2 games. In the fantasy playoffs, sometimes you may have to start somebody with more upside, but it's win in advance. And the best opportunity to do that is grab the guys that could potentially see the most volume. Now, Jalen Hyatt has not played yet because as of this recording, Monday Night Football had not happened. But 2 weeks ago, prior to the bye, he had a huge day going for 100 yards through the air. If that were to happen on Monday Night Football again, he's going to be one of the top waiver ads in all of fantasy football, and he would end up climbing this list as well. So keep an eye on his name, and if you haven't already added him and you need help at the wide receiver position, Hyatt could end up being the perfect guy. John Mechie finds his way into this episode because of all the injuries Houston has right now. Dalton Schultz is banged up. Tank Dell is out for the rest of the season. Nico Collins had to leave the game early this past week with an injury. And Noah Brown hasn't exactly been healthy either over the last few weeks. Now, a lot of people are still going to be running to Noah Brown, and his ownership percentage right now is a little on the high side. So let's take a look at somebody that's a little bit lower owned. John Mechie, if we were to end up missing Nico Collins, could end up being a big deep play threat and maybe not give you the floor that you would want, but his ceiling could absolutely be there in this matchup. All right, my first 2 tight ends to talk about are going to be Cade Otton and Chigioco, because both of them have terrific matchups to finish out the fantasy season. And for Cade Otton, he's going to be #1 for me. He had a touchdown last week, but given the amount of snaps that he plays, more than any tight end in football, and with the really good matchups he has here in the fantasy playoffs, he absolutely could be the streaming option that we all need. And Chigioco, once again, I have not seen him yet this week because he plays on Monday Night Football. But if he has another decent day, because he's been running more routes than almost any tight end in football over the last couple of weeks, and also is seeing a decent amount of targets, given his matchups facing Houston in 2 of his last 3 games, he absolutely could be a fantasy steal to end the year. Logan Thomas is only going to be a guy that I'm grabbing for this week if I really need somebody, because right now the LA Rams are allowing the 6th most fantasy points to the tight end position. Logan Thomas, we've seen him have a decent floor all season long. It's his ceiling that has been the issue, but his floor in this matchup could be more than enough to help us get through the week. And then if he scores that touchdown against a Rams defense that has issues stopping tight ends, he absolutely could be in the mid to low end tight end 1 area. Hunter Henry is going to have a really nice matchup this week against Kansas City, but how much are you willing to risk with him as your tight end in the first round of the fantasy playoffs? The dude has basically disappeared since week 3 of the season, and even with a couple of touchdowns last week, it's really hard to trust what he could do moving forward. We thought he was going to be the dude for Mac Jones. That didn't quite work out. Can he now be the dude for Bailey Zappi? Are you struggling at the quarterback position right now due to injuries? Well, Joe Flacco and Jake Browning are here to save your fantasy season. And in 2023, I can promise you I never had that on my bingo card is something that I would say this year. Flacco is officially the starter for the rest of the season, and he has really good matchups in week 15 and week 16 that could bring some high upside potential for you. And Jake Browning against Minnesota in week 15 is going to be a really good matchup, and maybe we won't be able to stream him the rest of the year, but if you're trying to get through this week because you have maybe Justin Herbert or you're still reeling from some of the injuries earlier in the season, then this could be be a guy with some decent upside as well. And this only makes sense if you love to play with fire. And Zach Wilson, I don't know if I would be willing to risk him in the first week of the fantasy playoffs, but if you have no other options, you have no other options, because some of you out there play in deeper leagues where you may be looking to grab anybody that could be available. And Zach Wilson looked really good last week. Now, Miami's defense can be tough at times, but if they're able to put up a lead on the New York Jets, the Jets are going to have to throw the football, and that leads to volume for Zach Wilson. Hopefully he doesn't make any mistakes, but if he can carry over his performance from this week to next week, he absolutely could be a guy that with a really low floor comes a really nice ceiling. But once again, how risky are you willing to get? Atlanta is going to lead the way for my defensive special team streamers this week, and Atlanta gets a poor Carolina offense. So this defensive unit has the opportunity to not only keep the score low and keep the yards low, but also create turnovers and sack Bryce Young. They definitely would lead the way in terms of streaming options this week. This Vegas defense has played a lot better since Josh McDaniels was fired, and now at home, they get a Herbertless Chargers offense with a backup quarterback that is unproven and untested at the NFL level. Definitely a great opportunity to create turnovers. And while Indianapolis's defense got smacked around this past week, they are still scoring the 4th most fantasy points of any defensive special team unit in all of fantasy football. And maybe the Mitchell Trubisky magic from last Thursday has worn off for the Pittsburgh Steelers a little bit. And if that's the case, then Indianapolis absolutely has an opportunity to cause a little bit of chaos for him and the Steelers offense. Now, as far as dropping players go, the same thing over the last couple of weeks. Earlier in the season, we listed guys that we could potentially move on from, but because of all the injuries that we've had, and because of it being the playoffs and the fact that now we're not necessarily keeping guys to use for the rest of the season, but keeping guys to stream, we may not want to drop somebody just because they haven't been producing very much for us, because their matchups in the playoff could be quite incredible. So let me know down in the comments below, who do you think that you're dropping this week? And who do you think you're gonna pick up in their place? Add and drop the names of the 2 players, leave it at that in the comments, and I'll try to answer as many as I can during the day here on Monday. But Headliner Nation, for now, I'm gonna get out of here. I've got running back research that I've gotta go do. Peace out, Headliner Nation. Stay safe and stay healthy, and I'll catch you all on the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.